CCSS present four fundamental challenges to teachers' existing practice. One is an increasing emphasis on informational text. So the standards are going to force us to think about ways to put literary text and non-literary text into meaningful conversation. A second is increased text complexity. The argument of the standards is that kids read texts that's not sufficiently complex so that when they get to college, they're not ready to read what they're expected to read in college. Now, interestingly, here, while the standards call for having kids read more complex texts, they don't really talk very much about the instructional experiences that will prepare them to read those more complex texts. So the argument that I would make is that we need to think hard and deep about how to prepare our kids to enter those worlds of complexity. A third challenge is an increased emphasis on close reading. So if you look at the anchor standards, especially if you look at how they're spun out in the different grade level bands, you'll see that there's definite emphasis on thinking hard about particular texts. Now the argument that I want to make then is we need to situate close reading with broad reading. We need to create contexts in which the close reading pays off. That is, in which close reading is rewarded by giving kids important stuff to think with as they pursue questions that matter to them in the here and now. And finally, the CCSS, I think, put an increased emphasis on argumentation. And so what that means is we have to create an instructional context in which making a case is something that kids have to do every day. Not to write a interpretive argument in which they echo what the teacher said, but rather to engage seriously in interpretive questions, in moral questions, and philosophical questions, to have them articulate their points of view and defend and explain them. The focus of the standards could be seen to be narrowly intellectual, analytic. What they talk about are analytic understandings of text. If we're going to make reading motivating to kids, we have to show them that texts matter, that the ideas matter to them in their lives, and thinking about the way that their lives should be lived. So what I hope teachers recognize is that understanding the moral dimensions, or working with kids to talk seriously and to consider deeply the moral dimensions of the work that they're reading, is what's going to make it relevant. They're going to see, we want our students to see that the ideas in books matter in thinking about how they ought to live their lives. It's not empty analysis, it's not an empty academic exercise. It's something that matters in thinking about the kind of person that you want to be. So I really hope that that dimension isn't lost as people pay increasing attention to the analytic understandings that the Common Core State Standards seek to develop. Common Core State Standards talk about goals, and they talk a lot about what they want students to be able to do with individual texts, but they don't think about larger curricular organizations that are going to allow those things to happen. So one of the things that I like about the work that you've been doing is that you've been thinking hard about how components of a larger curricular framework relate to each other. So that if you teach a separate thing, a separate text, if you don't worry about it, that doesn't make sense to me. I think what we should be doing is thinking about developing robust understandings that can be that we ask students to apply in increasingly complex situations. So although the standards don't talk much about integration, curricular integration, developing units, and so on, I think that if we're going to be successful in achieving them, that's something that we have to do.